should be. Okay, it's starting.
Well, for all of you who've never met me, I'm Robert Craig Russell Jr. I was born in May 18th, 1948 in Charlotte, North Carolina. My parents were Juanita Davis and Robert Russell Sr. And they had met actually after the war. My father was in World War II. And after the war, they were both teaching in Belmont, North Carolina, which is not far from Charlotte. And they were living in the teacherage. And what a teacherage was sort of like a boarding house for teachers. And so at night, after all the lesson plans were done and supper was over, the teachers would play bridge, and my parents became bridge partners, and that's how they met, and how they came to get engaged and get married. And I guess there was no major hospital in Belmont, so I was born at Mercy Hospital in Charlotte, Catholic hospital, and I know that was in those days the men did not go into the birth room with their wives. So my father and my Aunt Edith were out in the waiting room while my mother was in labor. And they both smoked, and at some point they ran out of cigarettes, but they were afraid to go out, for either of them to go out and get any more, because they were afraid they wouldn't be there when the doctor came out. And actually, after I was born, for a little while, we lived with Edith, I think. And then we moved to Oak Hill. Oak Hill is close to Morganton, North Carolina. It was a rural school. My father was the principal there, and I lived the first 4 years of my life there. And I remember just little snatches of it. I can vaguely remember like community suppers. They'd have community suppers at the school, and that's where I was introduced to chicken and dumplings and sauerkraut, which I call strings, I'm told. In my earliest clear memory is when we were living in an old house in Morganton, and I remember being awakened in the middle of the night. I would have been not quite 3, but I remember this distinctly, is that my parents were rushing around, and my father had on his those old ribbed undershirts, and he was shaving, and my mother was running around. She had her slip on, and she was getting dressed and everything. And they told me that my grandfather had died, my Daddy Milton had died, and that we were going to Mother Betty's house. That was in eastern North Carolina. And I remember this was so typical of my mother. She said, "Now be sure not to ask where Daddy Milton is when we get there." But I remember that very distinctly. I don't remember anything about the funeral. I think from what my parents said, I don't think I went to the funeral, but I do. You can edit this, can't you?
Yeah.
That she didn't pee, did she?
So wait, do you need to think of some more stuff real fun?
So you were talking about the memory with Daddy Milton's funeral.
And I think I actually have a memory of Daddy Milton, which would have been maybe sometime shortly before that, because I think I remember, and I know nobody ever told me this, I think I remember being out there was a park close to their house, and I remember being out there, and there were a bunch of trees, and we saw a squirrel. And I think I remember him saying, "You got to be careful when a squirrel gets close to you, because you never know when they're going to run up your britches leg." And I've asked my mother and various other people that knew Daddy Milton, and they said, "I don't remember anything about that, but that sounds like something he would have said."
How old were you when he died?
I was not quite 3.
Wow.
He died in March, the end of March in '51, and I wasn't quite 3, so.
Do you have a visual memory of what he looked like?
The only memory I have is as I said, I think it's a memory, was being out there looking at the squirrel, and I just remember him being this enormously tall man, but then I was, an enormously short boy at that time.
Since we're recording this at Christmas,
Do you have any really strong Christmas memories? Like a favorite Christmas or a very memorable Christmas? And what kinds of Christmas gifts did you get when you were a kid? Because we get iPods and stuff. You know, those are the sort of things that kids get now. What did you and your brother and sister get?
Well, I remember when we went, after we moved, when I was about 6, we moved back to Eastern North Carolina. My father took a principal's job there, and we lived close to my grandmother. The town we lived in was just 3 miles away, and I remember every Christmas we would go over and get my grandmother,
No, this is Mother Betty.
Mother Betty. We would go get Mother Betty and bring her over to our house, and we would have Christmas Eve dinner, which was invariably homemade chicken salad and chicken and dumplings. And then she would spend the night at our house. And our family tradition is that we would open presents on Christmas Eve. And then we'd do Santa Claus on Christmas morning. And I don't have any particular, probably the best present I ever got, and maybe I didn't realize it until later, was one year when I was about maybe 10 or 11, I got a chess set. And so I taught myself to play chess from just the instructions that came with the set. And that was one of those just little kind of throwaway gifts that brought me so much pleasure over my life. But I remember, one year I got a bike, and I was really glad to get that bike because I'd had to ride for several years. I had a hand-me-down bike from my girl cousin, and it was a girl's bike, which was just wouldn't do. But I finally got a real bike. I remember we would always get to open one present early before Christmas Eve, and so I would carefully study all the presents and I'd pick out the one I wanted to open, and invariably I thought, oh, I wish I had picked out that one.
So when you moved back to Eastern North Carolina, did you move directly to Pikeville?
No, we had actually left Oak Hill and moved to a town called Norwood in Stanley County, not too terribly far from Charlotte. And we were there a couple of years, and then we moved to Wayne County, and we spent a year at Seven Springs in Wayne County. It was further east in Wayne County. And then the summer between first grade and second grade, we moved to Pikeville.
Now, was all of this moving because of your parents getting different jobs?
Yeah.
Teaching jobs?
Really, my dad getting different jobs.
Mm.
But I think it was also because they wanted to get closer to my grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
Since my grandfather had died, and so my grandmother had 3 daughters, but one of them was in Charlotte and one was in Chicago. So I think my mother just wanted to get closer to her mother.
Mm-hmm. And these daughters are Pam and Edith?
Pam and Edith, and then my mother also had a half-sister, Hattie, who was the oldest, and Hattie was the daughter of Daddy Milton and his first wife, who had died in childbirth. And my mother said that Hattie would spend some summers with them, but mostly she was raised by her mother's sister, who was married to my grandfather's brother. So Hattie and they were half sisters, but they were very close.
Mm-hmm. This is Alice?
Well, Alice was Hattie's double first cousin.
So that's a different person?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And Alice was my grandfather and his brother Dred had married sisters. Hattie's mother, who was also named Hattie, and my great aunt Olivia. So they were double first cousins because their fathers were brothers and their mothers were sisters.
Wow.
And so, Hattie spent a lot of time with my mother's family too, and she actually named my mother. They told her she could choose the name, and where she got Juanita, I have no idea. I wish I had asked her when she was still living.
Mm-hmm.
Well, tell me a little bit about you as a schoolboy. I mean, what were your interests when you were going to school? What did you excel at? Did you play any sports?
I love sports. My greatest love was probably baseball, and I was never very good at baseball. I had a good throwing arm, and I was pretty good. I had good speed, but I couldn't hit a ball to save my life. But I really enjoyed playing, and basketball was a real passion. I played, just spent hundreds of hours playing basketball, and had every kid's dream, that one day I would play college ball, and I wasn't good enough, but I really loved playing basketball. So those were my big sports. I liked school. Pretty much liked all subjects, except I wasn't very good in science. I made good grades in science, but that was probably my weakest. I loved history and language arts and math. Didn't like drawing. I have no artistic talent whatsoever. And I remember one day in 4th grade, the teacher, who was this very strict teacher, said, one day about a month into school, she said, there are only 3 of you who have learned anything this whole year. And it was me and 2 other kids. And she said, okay, so while the rest of you do your regular school stuff, they're going to get to draw all day. No. It was like a punishment. But I would, we didn't have a lot of, all the things. We didn't have video games and all that stuff. So we would, during the summers, we'd play baseball every day, just choose up and play sides. And we'd do the same thing for basketball after school in the winters and at recess. And we used to ride our bikes a lot. We'd play cowboys and Indians and cops and robbers and stuff like that. And then just about every Saturday when I was younger, I would go over to see my grandmother, Mother Betty, and the kid and I next door would always go to the movies. And it was funny, it was this little town, the town of Fremont. There was one little theater, and it was, it got the movies like 2 or 3 years after they'd come out, but we didn't care. And we didn't care what time the movie started. We'd just go in, and a lot of times it would be in the middle of the movie, and we'd see the movie, and we would, then it would start over, and they'd have a cartoon and a serial, which was like an adventure thing that would run over a 12-week period or something, and a newsreel. There was all this introductory stuff. And then the movie would start, and then at some point we'd say, oh, okay, here's where we came in, and we'd leave. It never bothered us that we already knew the ending. And then just about every summer I would go and spend a week with Mother Betty. And I'd help her in her yard. She really liked to do yard work and gardening. And she'd cook all my favorite meals. And I remember we used to go for walks at night after supper. We'd just go walking through this little town. And I can remember as we were walking down the street, all these men that we would pass, and they were just about all wearing hats. And they'd always kind of tip their hat and say, good evening, Miss Betty. And she'd say, good evening, whatever his name was.
So you were the oldest of 3 children.
I was the oldest of 3. My sister Margaret was born when we were living in either Oak Hill or Morganton. I don't remember. They were right there together. She was born in December of '52, and I remember it was really cold, and we lived in this drafty old house. And my grandmother, Mother Betty, came to stay with me while my parents were at the hospital. And I remember it was just this bitter cold night, and the house wasn't very well insulated. And I remember my grandmother getting all these newspapers and stuffing them up against the door, the crack at the bottom of the door, and then pushing these cartons of Coke bottles against them to try to keep the wind out.
So she was born at home?
No, my parents were at the hospital. My grandmother had come to visit, to stay with me. I don't know how she got there because she didn't drive. And this was before we had moved, to near her. Mm-hmm. And then my brother David was 9 years younger than I. He was born in April of '57. And when he was born, I was in the hospital with a bad case of pneumonia. And I guess it was a really low time for my mother because I was in the hospital with this pneumonia they couldn't figure out how to cure. And my sister had just had eye surgery, and then my brother was born with club feet.
Wow.
So I guess it was a really low period for her.
And by this point, you were living in Pikeville?
We were living in Pikeville. And I remember when I first got sick with pneumonia, as they did during that time, my father just called the doctor. It was on a Saturday. And it wasn't our regular doctor. There were actually, even though it was a little town, there were two doctors. So he called like the old doctor, Dr. Rose, and he came over to the house and looked me over and did what they always did back then. He gave me a shot of penicillin. And then he was getting ready to leave, and my dad said, well, how much do I owe you? And he looked at his watch and he said, well, I've got another call to make, but I don't have to go for a while. He said, do you watch the baseball game of the week? And my dad said, yeah, we're just getting ready to watch it. And he said, well, the Giants are playing today, and if you would let me sit here and watch with you long enough to see Willie Mays bat just once, there won't be any charge. So.
Now, you said that he gave you a shot of penicillin. I thought you were allergic to penicillin.
That didn't develop till much later.
Oh, okay. Okay. How do you remember growing up with your brother and sister? How was your relationship as children?
We were close when we were little. I think as I got older, we weren't as close. I think they were closer than I was to either of them. And I remember at one point I was interested in literature and music to a much larger extent than the rest of my family was. So as I got older, I spent a lot of time in my room just listening to music and reading.
Do you have any sense of where that interest came from, or do you think it just sort of developed?
I don't know. I have no idea. I know my father had a set of Harvard classics, and I started reading those. And one thing I'll always remember is I pulled out a book that was the works of Goethe, and it's spelled Goethe. And I was about 8 years old or 9 years old, and I went to my father and I said, "How do you pronounce this?" And he said, "Goethe." And I thought, well, so much for asking him anything. That's obviously not it. It was either Goethe or Goeth or something.
So what was do you remember, because I know Craig was crazy about Three Little Pigs when he was young.
Mm-hmm.
Books, movies, anything that had to do with them. What was your earliest book that you loved?
Peter Rabbit.
Peter Rabbit?
Peter Rabbit. I love Peter Rabbit.
And how did that, obviously you're not reading Peter Rabbit now. Can you, go through the books that you loved at different times in your life and how that's changed?
Well, there's a period when I remember as I got on into school, I loved the Hardy Boys. I read all of the Hardy Boys. And I like to read, there were these biographies that were in all the school libraries, and they were about the childhood of famous people, mostly famous men, but some famous women. And there was one series for elementary students and another series for middle school students, and I read them all. I remember one of them had blue covers and one of them had orange covers, but I read them all. And I'm sure they weren't that authentic, but I just loved them. I just devoured them. And then as I got older, I started reading classic authors, and I always liked to read history and biography. And I always loved music. When I was younger, I would just listen to top 40 and stuff. And, so I was there for kind of the early days of rock and roll. And I can remember just loving Elvis Presley, and Buddy Holly was probably my favorite. This is when I was really young, like 8 and 9. But then, I don't remember how it happened, but I somehow got hold of a classical album. And it was just one of those, something like hit songs from the Immortal Classics, But I just developed this real interest in classical music, and then, so that seed was planted. And when I went on to college, I had a roommate that had like a Reader's Digest series of all the great, classical masterpieces. And so I listened to all those, and then I took some music appreciation courses, and that's been, one of the big loves of my life is music, classical music especially.
So, what would you say the other big loves of your life have been?
Another one is baseball. I am a big baseball fan. Um, I've got all these books on baseball history and baseball statistics. I know a lot about that. And I think maybe that was partly in my blood because I remember I have a cousin. It's my mother's cousin, Daphne, and she was the daughter of Uncle Weaver. And Uncle Weaver was my grandfather, Daddy Milton's youngest brother. And I don't remember whether Uncle Weaver told me this or Daphne told me this, or maybe Landis, Daphne's brother. But when all these boys were growing up, Daddy Milton's family had something like 9 boys and 2 girls. And when they were growing up, they'd work on the farm and work really hard. But when the newspaper would get delivered, they all got to take a break so they could look up the baseball scores.
When you were young, you worked in tobacco, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that.
Well, I started probably the summer after I was in 7th grade. And tobacco was still farmed in a pretty traditional way then. The tobacco and there are different kinds of tobacco. The kind of tobacco that grew in that part of the country is called bright-leaf tobacco. And, you grew it in the fields and it ripened from the ground up. So it'd be about a 6 to 8 week process of harvesting the tobacco. So you'd have some people that worked out in the fields doing what was called cropping tobacco. And you would pull off the leaves. And then you would have, there would be what they called a truck driver. And it was a tractor that pulled it was like a cart, a flatbed cart, but it had sort of like feed sack type material. I don't know what you call it, burlap maybe, that was all around. There were poles, and it was hooked onto those. So you would crop the tobacco and put it in the truck. And then when it was filled, the truck driver would take it to the barn. And it was mostly women at the barn, and they would, some of them were called loopers or stringers, and they'd have 2 little stands, and they'd have a tobacco stick, which was about this long, and about maybe 1.5 inches square. And then they'd have a thing of twine, so they'd take about 3 leaves at a time and wrap twine around it until, they covered the stick, and then they'd tie it off. And then you'd have usually 2 guys. One of them would be up in the barn. He was hanging, and the other one was doing what's called poking up. So he'd take the stick and, hand it up to the guy in the barn, and they'd hang it. And
what did you do?
well, my first year or so, I think I may have spent the first year handing, because I wasn't quite old enough to crop. But from that point on, I would either crop or hang. And I don't know which was harder. Cropping, the first couple of weeks was really hard because, as I say, it ripened from the ground up. So that first couple of weeks you would be almost all the way down at the ground. You either had to get on your knees or stoop way over. And you'd go out early. We'd start about 6 o'clock in the morning, and the plants would still be real wet with dew. So after a little while of working in it, you'd be soaking wet, and it would still be kind of chilly. But then pretty soon the sun would come up, and you'd be burning up. But then hanging was pretty hard too, because you were going up and down, and it got really, really hot in those barns. They had usually just one little window for draft, and so the fuller the barn got, the hotter it got. And then I didn't have that much to do with this part, but they had burners in the barn. I think originally they'd been wood burners. At that time they were either oil or natural gas or something. But after all the tobacco was hung, the farmer would light the burners, and then the tobacco would cure. It was heat cured.
And this was something that you did during the summers, right? Not during the regular year?
During the summers.
Do you remember how much you got paid?
When I first started, I think I was getting 75 cents an hour. And then when I went to either hanging or cropping, it was $1. No, I know what it was. When I was, actually that first summer I did crop, but you'd be walking between rows of tobacco, and when you got older and faster and stronger, you could do what was called carrying two rows, and you could walk along and keep pace and pick the leaves of the rows on either side of you. But that first summer, there were some other kids my age, and we could just carry one row. So we got 75 cents an hour. The people who were handing got 60 cents an hour. The people who were looping got 75 cents an hour. But if you were hanging or cropping, you got $1 an hour. And by the time I finished high school, it was $1.25 an hour.
Was that pretty good, or was that like minimum wage sort of thing?
I don't even think there was a minimum wage at that time. It seemed good to us. But I know that even after minimum wage came in, farm help was exempt from it. Farmers were exempt from it.
Now, this time when you did this was still during segregation. Were there black workers too, or was it just white
There were
workers?
black workers too. Some of them were local, some of them were migrants. And one thing I can distinctly remember is when we were cropping out in the field, one of the important jobs of the truck driver, the guy who drove the tractor, was to bring us water, because it got really hot and you get really thirsty. And the water was always in mason jars. And you didn't have individual cups, you just drank out of the mason jar. So there'd always be 2 mason jars. And it was one for the black workers and one for the white workers. And I remember once it was me and a bunch of, I was the only white person out there. And the guy, the truck driver, he was a real jerk. He kept forgetting the black guy's water jug, forgetting. And so after a couple times, as soon as he was gone, I said, "Look, I don't mind if you don't," and gave him some of my water. Because,
Yeah,
it's pretty stupid.
So talk about your memories of high school.
Of high school, well, I really liked going to high school because my father was a school principal. And so from the time I was in the 1st grade through the 8th grade, my father was always principal of the school. And then when I was in 8th grade, my mother taught me 2 classes a day.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was just, I just felt like I was always, on pins and needles, and, I had to behave extra well, and, I just felt like there was too much. And my father also coached all the sports teams, so it was just too much closeness. So I was really glad to get that there was a consolidated high school that had been built the year before I started high school. And it consolidated 1, 2, 3, I guess, of the rural schools. And it was so funny because there was all this opposition to consolidation, and people saying, "Well, I'm not gonna, I just don't know if I can get along with those people from, Nahana and Eureka," but, we all went to high school and became friends with, and so I liked high school. I did well. I dated one girl throughout high school. Started dating her my sophomore year, and
How did you meet her?
just in classes.
Mhm.
I think when we first really met is when we were lab partners in biology, and I cut up her frog for her. But we dated all through high school, and then we broke up after we went to college.
You went to different colleges?
We went to different colleges, and she went to college in Florida, and we just, broke up.
Did you originally intend to stay together?
Oh, yeah.
But it didn't.
Well, I did. I don't know whether she did or not. But it didn't work out, and it was probably for the best.
Well, what was dating like this would have been the early 60s, mid 60s?
Yeah, my high school years were 62 to 66. Oh, well, we'd go to a movie, and then after the movie we'd go out for, get hamburgers or ice cream cones or something like that, and then we'd go back to her house, and there was a sitting room with a fireplace, and so we'd sit in there and listen to music and make out.
What did your parents think of her? Her name was, is it Carol?
Carol. They got along okay. I think they went to visit her parents once, and her father announced that he was an atheist, and that just kind of, my parents had a lot of trouble with that. But they got along okay. And I got along really well with her mother. I didn't get along that well with her father because we would get into political arguments, and I learned early on not to argue politics with him. After that, we got along okay.
What were his politics?
Very conservative.
So he was conservative, but in this time, conservatism and religion weren't as tied as they are now.
Not for him anyway.
What else about high school? Do you remember?
I played sports. I played basketball, but never really, started very few games. I didn't get much playing time until my senior year. But I discovered track, and I turned out to be really good at track. And actually, my senior year, I set a conference record for the long jump, which was called the broad jump back then. And I was pretty good in middle distance running. And I remember they had what were called, I think, regional meets. The state was divided into like 3 or 4 regions. And so I think the coaches could actually decide who to send. So there were 4 of us that went to the regional meet. And I was there for the long jump, the broad jump, and it was then called the 880, now it's the 800 meters. So I came very close to qualifying for state in broad jump. I didn't quite make it. So then I went to warm up for the 880, and back then all the schools were segregated. I mean, totally segregated. And so we had a conference, but it was all white schools. And there was another conference in the same county that was all black schools. But when it got to the level of the state division meets, it was black and white mixed. So we got out and people were warming up for the 880, and I saw these black kids warming up, and I thought, I'm in real trouble here. And so I didn't even come close to placing.
Did you continue with track at all in college?
I did track my freshman year in college, and then just kind of, I just wasn't that competitive.
And you went to the University of North Carolina. Did you ever have any question about what college you would go to? Did you apply to other schools?
I applied to Wake Forest, but I think I kind of always knew. I got accepted at Wake Forest, but I think I always kind of knew I was going to go to UNC.
How did you pay for it?
My parents helped me some, and I worked.
What did you do?
I worked in the medical library.
Let me think.
Well, how did you decide what you wanted to do for your career?
Well, I graduated. See, I went to college planning to be a lawyer, and the '60s kind of got in the way. I got real involved in the civil rights movement and marched in some civil rights marches, and then I got involved in the anti-war movement. I went with a bunch of other college students. In 1968, I went on a bus to Columbus, Indiana, to campaign door to door for Eugene McCarthy. And then I went to Washington, D.C. with some friends for a couple of anti-war rallies. And I actually found out years later that Louisa, who was to become my wife years later, she was at those same rallies, but we never saw each other. And also, soon after I graduated from college, some friends and I went, UNC was playing in the Peach Bowl football in Atlanta, and some friends and I went, and it turned out that Louisa was there too, but anyway. But as far as a career, I left college not really knowing what I wanted to do, and I continued to work in the medical library for a couple of years. And I was on a grant program, and the grant ended, and they offered me a permanent job, but I decided I knew I didn't want to be a low-level library worker forever. So I actually quit, and a friend and I went to Mexico. We took a trip to Mexico, and we camped out the whole time we were in the United States. We didn't camp out in Mexico. But we went to Mexico. We had planned to go all the way to Mexico City, but we ran out of money before we got there. And then came back, and we didn't have any money, so I went to work for Manpower, which was a temporary help agency, and worked there for several months. And then, I don't know, somewhere in there, I decided that I enjoyed working in a library, and I decided to get a master's in library science. But I needed to work to save some money, so I got a job as a technician or assistant or whatever they called it in the student teaching office at UNC. And I was a secretary. So I worked there for a year and then went to graduate school.
What drove you to take a trip to Mexico?
I don't know. We just, it was a good friend of mine who later became a fairly famous musician, but we just,
What was his name?
Mike Craver. I don't know, we just got interested in Mexico and decided to go.
And that's pretty much the extent of your traveling outside of the country, is that right?
That's pretty much it.
And how did you get there?
We drove my 66 Mustang.
I didn't know you had a 66
I had a 66 Mustang.
What color?
Baby blue, Carolina blue.
My mom had one that was
Did she
baby
really?
blue. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that car. It was a 3-speed. I don't think they made that many 3-speeds. And it had that faux wood and paneling and everything interior. And I love that car. But I wound up, I had about 130,000 miles on it, which was a lot for a car back then. And so when I was between college and graduate school, I had no money. And the car, it was this week and this next week. And I sold the car for just a pittance, just a few $100s. And of course, and the body was still in perfect shape. And, I wished many times I still had that car because they're worth a lot now.
I never knew that. That's so cool.
Where did you get it? Did you buy it new?
No, when I was a senior in college, my father bought it for me. It was a used car. We went and looked at a couple cars, and that was the one I chose.
And that was your first car?
That was my first car.
So how was your relationship with your parents and your family during that period, during college and between college and graduate school? Did you stay in touch with them a lot?
Oh yeah, I stayed in touch. I didn't visit probably as often as I should have, but yeah, we stayed in touch, and I always went home for Christmas and Thanksgiving and stuff.
How did they feel about your involvement in the civil rights movement and your rallies and your marches? And
Not too good. They didn't know about all of it. But when I was a freshman, there was a cafeteria workers strike. And it was, all the cafeteria workers lived in this town called Carborough, it was just adjacent to Chapel Hill. I mean, you'd be driving down the main street in Chapel Hill and, you'd cross some line and you were in Carborough. And it was starting to change, but essentially all the black people lived in Carborough. And they were all the cafeteria workers and stuff. And they really weren't treated very well because they put them on these split shifts and, doing everything to avoid having to pay overtime or benefits. So they were getting kind of a lousy deal. Well, I was in a demonstration, like 150 or 200 other students. But my Aunt Hattie lived in that same county, in Orange County. And so somehow the county newspaper took a photograph, and somehow among all these students, Aunt Hattie picked me out and circled me and sent the article to my parents. And so I got the call saying, "This is not what we're sending you to school for." So they were not real wild about it.
just because it detracted from your studies?
Well, I mean, my parents were good people, but they were kind of stuck in the racial stereotypes of the time. And I used to, even in high school, I used to have these horrible arguments with my mother about civil rights. And
so where do you think, if they were the environment that you grew up in, where do you think your different racial views from theirs
I don't
came
know.
from?
I've often asked myself that, and I don't know. I just know it solidified sometime in high school. And Well, it was kind of, I'm not claiming to be on a par with Molly Ivins, but she talked about growing up in that kind of environment. And she said one day, maybe stuff is gradually sinking in, but she said one day I just looked around at how things were, and I said, this can't possibly be right. There's no way this is what God intended. And I had kind of a similar experience. You just look and you think, no.
And what else did you do as part of the civil rights movement? Was it mostly demonstrations?
Just demonstrations, yeah.
What was?
Same thing in the anti-war movement. I never got into like the violence and stuff.
Never chained yourself to anything.
What was it like being at a demonstration?
It was kind of exciting. It was kind of strange. I don't like crowds, and I would get a little bit nervous being in the midst of all these crowds. And there were some people who were a lot more radical than I was, and you could tell that they really wanted it to erupt into something bigger, and I didn't. I didn't like, unlawful, throwing rocks and stuff like that. I kind of stayed away from that. And most of my friends that were in the movement did.
Did you know a lot of people that went to Vietnam?
Not that many. I had a couple people from high school and a couple people in college. I didn't know anyone who was killed in Vietnam.
So, how much did the war influence your life? How much of an influence did the war have on your life?
It solidified probably my position as a liberal.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me more of the distrust that I'd had before about the government. Because as we know now, there was a lot of lying about the war. I mean, the whole Gulf of Tonkin business wasn't really true.
Let's see. Talk more about the environment of the 60s. What was it like being a part of all of the upheaval that was going on?
Or did you even recognize it as upheaval or movement and change?
I knew things were changing a lot. But see, I was never I was never a hippie, and I was never, into the whole drug culture. I grew my hair long, but I was just never way out there. I think your mother was for a while, Louisa was for a while, but not all that much. So I found some of it pretty scary. The whole kind of violent demonstrations and stuff I found pretty scary because, I didn't think that was the answer. But I did spend a year of my life, I knew I had read enough about Vietnam that I knew I wasn't going to go to the war. And so I spent a year of my life saying, okay, if I get drafted, am I going to go to jail or am I going to go to Canada? Because I knew I was going to do one of those two things. And luckily I got a high draft number. I was in the first year of the draft lottery, and I got a high number, 278. It's one of those things you never forget.
What does a high number mean?
Well, they would have the days from January 1st to December 31st, all in some kind of a barrel, and they draw out the first one. And whatever number that was 1. Mm-hmm. And so every birth date had a number. And then when they started calling people up, they would call them up by the numbers. So maybe the first call up of the year would be numbers 1 through 60 or something. So everybody whose birthdays had been drawn for number 1 through 60 would get drafted. Okay. And luckily they didn't get to 278.
Would you, if it had been a different kind of war, would you have considered serving, or were you just against war in general?
No, I can't say I'm not a pacifist. It was that war I was opposed to. I think, you can't ever say. I think if it had been, say, another war like World War II, I would have gone. I wouldn't have liked going, but I think I would have gone. But I had just read enough about that war to say, I'm not dying for this.
Sorry to interject, and you mentioned World War II, and I'd forgotten to ask this earlier. Where did your father serve in World War II?
He was in, I don't know the exact, he was in Italy and Sicily and North Africa. Mm-hmm. And he was in a medical supply unit. and he just would not talk about the war. I mean, he was never in combat, but I think being in a medical supply unit, he probably saw a lot of stuff that he would just as soon have not remembered. So it was really, he just wouldn't talk about it. He'd say something every now and then, but.
Can you remember any specifics of things he said?
I remember once when he was in North Africa, they were getting on a plane to go somewhere, and so they got on the plane, and then they said the plane was overloaded, it was too much weight. So they told them they all had to take their backpacks and empty out, like 3/4 of what was in there. They could only carry the real essentials. So they did, and they got back on the plane, and we're sitting there kind of looking out the windows waiting for the plane to take off. And this is politically incorrect, but this is what my dad said. And he said, then all these Arabs just came out of the bushes, and before we even left, they had a bazaar set up selling our stuff.
So go back to sort of the narrative of your life. I mean, if it's, the time before you were in graduate school or the time when you were in graduate school?
Well, I think in college I kind of found myself because growing up I had a lot of friends, but I never had any friends that I felt like shared the same kind of intellectual interests that I did. But in college I met people who did and became friends with them. And I didn't do well in college. I think the reason, probably all kinds of reasons, but I had come from my parents were very strict. And so I had led kind of a secluded life. And I always had a curfew and had to be in at a certain time, and they always knew where I was. And suddenly I was at this liberal university with virtually no rules and nobody to make me do anything. And so my first, really 2 or 3 years, I didn't do well. I did pretty well my senior year, but I didn't wind up with a very good GPA. And I often wished I could have, done college again. Or maybe if I'd gone to a smaller college where, you had advisors who really kind of knew you as a person. But, I can't blame it on anyone else. But college was a very good time for me. I kind of figured out that, I had all these interests and it was okay, and there were other people who had those interests. And I spent a lot of time after college just kind of searching, just kind of figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. Till I, decided to go back to graduate school. I worked at a lot of, pretty menial jobs when I worked for Manpower.
Like what?
I worked in a General Electric plant, making plates for pieces of equipment. Like you get an order that said 120 volts, so and so many watts, and you had this machine that you had a template that you would trace that on, and meanwhile it was writing it on to you couldn't do it in mass quantities. It was one at a time.
Wow.
Where were you living during this time?
I was still living in Chapel Hill. I was living in this little efficiency apartment, efficiency duplex.
And so how did you decide to go to graduate school?
Well, I just figured, I said I got to do something. And I had enjoyed working in a library, so, I figured, well, I'll just do that.
About how old were you?
When I went to library school, wait a minute, when did I go to library school? It was like 23 or 24.
Mm.
No, it was more like 25, I guess.
Mm. And so talk about meeting my mother, Louisa.
Can we take a short break?
Oh yeah, sure. So talk a little bit about what you know about your family history.
Well, I know that my father's, both of his mother's family were all Scottish, and I'm not sure what part of Scotland they came from. There were Glens and Craigs and McLeans. They came from Scotland in the 1700s. came first to, I think they first came to South Carolina and then moved up into North Carolina. His mother was Essie Juliet Glenn, and her parents were James Taylor Glenn and Nancy Craig. Is that right? No, that's not right. Sorry. Her parents were James Taylor Glenn. No, that's right. James Taylor Glenn and Nancy Lavinia Craig. So that's where Craig, where your name comes from. I think my grandmother was one of the few women of that period. She was born in 1880 or 1881, and she went to college. She was one of the relatively few women during that period that went to college. She went to a college in Hickory called Claremont College. My father's father, David Lester Russell, his ancestors on one side were Scottish. On his father's side were Scottish. Dallas Harvey Russell, and then his father, David Russell. And they were Scottish and had come from the Isle of Wight in the Scottish Hebrides. They had come to first to Pennsylvania. Nobody came originally to North Carolina because it had no natural harbors. So the Russells and Morrisons came to Pennsylvania and then came down to North Carolina and settled in an area called the Rocky River area around Concord, which was not far from Charlotte. And then my great-grandfather, Dallas Russell, had to quit school when he was 7 years old because his father was drafted into the Confederate Army and died shortly afterward of typhoid fever. And they lived on a farm, and there was my grandfather and two younger sisters, so he pretty much had to quit school to help run the farm. My great-grandfather, sorry, Dallas Russell. So he never had...
Your great-grandfather was Dallas Russell or David Russell?
Was Dallas Russell. His father was David Russell.
Okay.
So he never had much of an education, but as a result of that, he really thought highly. He thought education was very important, and he became a very successful businessman. Eventually moved to Hickory, and became a very successful businessman, and actually endowed a lot of scholarships for poor students that enabled them to go to college, and also gave a lot of money to the Lutheran Church and to the. And anyway, my father's grandmother, paternal grandmother, was of German ancestry. She was Harriet Setzer, so her ancestors were German. So when my dad was growing up, actually, his parents never could decide between the Lutheran Church and the Presbyterian, so he kind of went back and forth.
Can you tell as much as you know of your parents' life stories? Just like if you were to tell grandmother and granddaddy's life stories in as much detail as you know them, how would you?
Well, my father there were 6 children in his family. There were 5 boys and a girl, and he was 4th of the 6th. His brother Glenn was the oldest, and then Elizabeth, and then Locke, and then my dad, and then John, and then Dick. And
they lived in Hickory?
They lived in Hickory. His father was an attorney and later a judge. And
this is David Lester Russell?
David Lester Russell. And Dick died when he was in high school. He had scarlet fever, which eventually developed into rheumatic fever and left him with a weak heart. So he died when he was in high school. And my dad always remembered, because he died the same day that Newt Rockne, the famous Notre Dame football coach, died. and there was a fire when my dad was growing up. There was a fire at their house, and his dad, I guess, was at work, and his mother had gone to the dressmakers with his sister Elizabeth, and so I think he and his brother John may have been the only ones at home, and they were staying there with a black man, who kind of watched out for them. So he got him out of the house. My dad said he remembered he was sitting in the kitchen eating an apple, and the guy staying with him said, "Come on, you got to get out." And it was the last time that the horse-drawn fire wagon was ever used in Hickory.
Wow.
And they lived next to the Catawba River. The Catawba River went through the back of their property. And I learned this later from someone who had been a music pupil of my dad's sister Elizabeth. But in the warm weather, gypsies used to camp out on the river.
Wow.
And my grandfather would always tell the kids, "Now don't go outside while the gypsies are there." And he'd look at my aunt and say, "Especially you, Elizabeth." But she said she told this music pupil of hers that she would often slip out of the house after supper and after all the dishes were done. She'd slip out. They had this wraparound porch, and so she would slip out and she would watch the gypsies, with their campfires on the river, and she would listen to the gypsy men play their fiddles, and how inspirational she found it.
Wow. Is that house still standing, do you know? Still
Yeah.
standing?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
It was recently renovated.
And so he grew up there in Hickory, granddaddy. Did he go to college directly after high school?
He went to college. He went to Lenore Rhine College, which was a Lutheran college that was there in Hickory. And it's funny, his grandfather, Dallas Russell, put all of his grandchildren through school. And he had this thing he wanted a musician and a lawyer and a teacher and musician, lawyer, teacher, and a minister. So my dad's oldest brother, Glenn, didn't go to college. He got in some dispute with his father and left home when he was 17 or 18. But then Elizabeth was a musician. She studied music at the Cincinnati Conservatory. And Locke was a lawyer. So when my dad came along, he had a choice of being a teacher or a minister. He chose teacher.
So it was he would pay for school, but this school.
Uh-huh.
Wow.
And I asked my dad if he resented that, and he said no, it was his money.
So did he go directly to? Did he go to regular college, or did he just go to teaching school?
No, he went and got an AB degree with a major in education. And I remember that when he got out, it was during the Depression, and he knew that he could make more money if he could coach, because there was a supplement for coaching, but you had to have some extra training for coaching. There was a program you had to go through, and it was offered during the summer, but it was like $40 or something, and he didn't have the money. So he went to his Uncle Bob, Robert Craig Glenn, for whom he and I are both named. And Uncle Bob was a real eccentric. He was he never married, and he had a master's, and I don't know what it was in, from University of North Carolina. And he always taught in private schools, and he may have taught Latin. I'm not sure. I don't know what he taught. But anyway, he went and asked Uncle Bob if he could borrow the money. So Uncle Bob lent him the money. But Dad said so he went and he got this certificate, and he got a job teaching and coaching. And when he got his first paycheck and came home at the end of the day, Uncle Bob was sitting on the porch swing waiting for his first payment.
Was this still in Hickory?
This was still in Hickory.
Mm.
So he taught all around. He taught in Granite Falls.
Do you know what level and what subject he taught?
He taught high school. He taught history. And he also taught public speaking. And I think there was somewhere they had a debating team, and he taught, debating, except it was called something different back then, oratory or
Forensics?
forensics, yeah, forensics. And he was a coach, and I remember he dropped out after a couple years of teaching, he wasn't sure that was what he wanted to do. So he stopped teaching for a couple years, and this good friend of his owned a restaurant, Woodrow Hill, so Hill's Cafe, so Dad worked there for a couple years. And he said that was the hardest work he ever did in his life, was working in a restaurant. So then he went back to teaching. I think teachers tended to move around a lot, I think. And then he was in 41, I think it was before Pearl Harbor maybe, or maybe it was just after Pearl Harbor. He was drafted, and
How old would he have been then?
he would have been,
He was born in 1913?
he would have 1909, so he would have been like 32 or 33.
Oh, wow.
And he was drafted, and his principal went to the draft board and said, couldn't you just let him finish out the school year? And they said, nope,
Wow.
need him now. So, and as I say, he was in for like 3.5 or 4 years and served in Italy and Sicily and North Africa, but I don't know where in North Africa.
So were your parents together during that time when he was?
No, and he didn't meet my mother till after he came back from the war. So they were pretty old when they got married. He would have been right at 38, and she was 30. So
Since we've gotten to the point where they're together, can you tell the story of grandmother up until that same point?
well, she was born in Fremont, Eastern North Carolina. Her father had grown up in a farming family. The Davises had been farmers since forever. Her father, Milton Davis, Otis Milton Davis, my grandfather, was one of, there were either 8 or 9 boys and 2 girls, and one of the girls died when she was in high school, so it was mostly a boy family. And the Davis ancestors had come from England way early on, like in the 1600s. They had come into Virginia, Isle of Wight, Virginia, and then moved into Perquimans County in northeastern North Carolina, and gradually worked their way to Wayne County. They were Quakers, so I was able to do a lot of genealogy on them because the Quakers kept records of everything. And then, so Daddy Milton left the farm, and he, at least the whole time my mother was growing up, he had jobs like he was postmaster for a long time, and he was a bookkeeper. He kept books for a lot of people, did stuff like that. I guess he didn't really like farming. And then Mother Betty was, she never finished high school. I don't even know if she went to high school. She came from a very poor family. Her mother had died when she was very young. So she was raised largely by her aunt and uncle. And she had always wanted to be a nurse, but she never had the money to be a nurse, to go to school. And she was my grandfather's second wife. As I said, his first wife had died in childbirth. And I don't know a lot about her ancestors. I think they were English, but I haven't been able to track them back as far as I have other branches of the family. She was a Bass. Her name was Betty Elizabeth Bass.
And so what was grandmother's life like growing up?
Well, they lived in town.
In Fremont?
In Fremont. There were 3 sisters. They all went to public school. Back then, school was just 11 years, 11 grades, and she never talked a lot about it. But, she played with her friends, and she said she remembered one day coming home from school with her sister Edith, and so they got in the house. And Edith, the minute they got in, said to Mother Betty, "Juanita had to stand in the corner today So then Mother Betty made her stand in the corner at home. And Edith felt so bad about telling on her that she went and stood in the corner with her.
Oh.
And I'm sure, so I asked, when I heard this, I asked Edith what my mother had to stand in the corner for, and she said, I'm sure it was talking, and, you know, I'm sure it was too. And when she decided she wanted to go to college, you know, nobody in her family had ever been to college.
When you say she, you mean grandmother?
Grandmother. She went to Daddy Milton and told him, you know, she wanted to go to East Carolina and get certified as a teacher. So she said he just sat down that night with, you know, a pen and paper and went through, and then the next night he said, well, here's how much I can afford to give you over the next 4 years. And so then she took that amount. You know, there was no, you know, it wasn't a matter of like they do it now and say, here's what we can lend you and everything, and here's what you'll have to pay. He just said, here's what I could pay. So she figured that, you know, between working and borrowing money, she could go, and so she did, and she worked in the dining halls and stuff.
You said this was East Carolina that you went to?
East Carolina, at that time it was East Carolina Teachers College. It's now East Carolina University.
Mm-hmm. And then she got a job teaching
She
after
taught
that?
several places. I think the first place she taught was in Elizabethtown, which is in eastern North Carolina, just off the coast.
Mm-hmm.
But she taught in any number of, as I say, teachers tended to move around a lot. And I don't know exactly her whole history, how she wound up in Belmont.
But it's Belmont where she and Granddaddy.
Where they
got
met,
together.
yeah.
And did you tell that story on tape?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now you had said two of your great life loves were baseball and music, right?
Uh-huh.
If you had to come up with two for your mother and two for your father, what do you think theirs would be? Or one, you know, something that they just love?
My dad's would be history and gardening. My mother, I really couldn't name one. She really didn't have any passions. I mean, my dad had a real passion for history. He loved it. He loved to study it, and he loved to teach it, and he loved to talk it. And then he grew beautiful, beautiful roses. I mean, he was known throughout the town for his roses. And he also liked to grow tomatoes, but roses were his first love. And he was also a talented flower arranger. A lot of times people, you know how in small churches they take turns bringing flowers to church, and often people would ask him to arrange their flowers. But I can't really say of any passions that my mother had.
How would you describe their personalities?
My mother, I think she was basically shy. And I think she was a worrier. She worried a lot about what people were going to think and what people were going to say. It kind of got better as she got older, but she spent a lot of her time worrying. My father was basically shy, but in crowds and everything, he could be pretty outgoing. And he was one that just loved, I could have seen him, you know, before he was married, probably going down to the village store and sitting around the pot-bellied stove and swapping tales, and he loved to do stuff like that.
You mentioned memories of both of your mother's parents. Do you have memories of your paternal grandparents?
They were, my grandmother died, grandmother Russell, died in 42 or 43. She died when my father was in the war, and he found out from a letter that his sister wrote him, and I've got that letter. It's just a precious letter. It's one of my treasures. And his father died in 47. It was after Granddaddy and Grandmother started dating, but before they were married. So I never knew either of them.
So the only one that you actually knew as
Mother
more
Betty.
than adult, or as more than a very young child, was Mother Betty. How
Yeah.
old were you when she died?
I was either a freshman or sophomore in high school.
Do you remember much about her personality?
I remember she was a really little woman. She couldn't have been anything over 5 feet, or not much over 5 feet, but she was just a bundle of energy. You know, she loved to cook, she loved to garden, she loved TV. She liked, this was way before your time, but there was a show called I've Got a Secret.
Mm-hmm.
She never missed I've Got a Secret. And she also was passionate about Parcheesi. She loved to play Parcheesi, and she kept all of her Parcheesi pieces in a Calumet baking soda or baking powder can. So we would play Parcheesi and sometimes checkers.
And she was a homemaker? She didn't have a job?
She had worked some before my parents were married. In fact, before she and Daddy Milton were married. In fact, may have worked some at the post office. That may have been where she met him.
All right.
But she didn't have much education at all. But she had beautiful penmanship, which I obviously didn't inherit.
Do you have any other family memories or knowledge that you want to pass on that you can think of right now?
Well,
Not to put you on the spot or
Yeah.
anything.
I guess just from doing genealogy, the oldest ancestor that I know anything of was John Glenn, who came. I always thought he was Scottish, but he came from Ireland, so he may have been Irish or he may have been Scotch-Irish.
And John Glenn is on Granddaddy's side?
Mm-mm. He's on he's on Granddaddy's side, on Granddaddy's mother's side. And he came over in the fairly early 1700s, or he was born like 1718 or 28. From what I've read, he came over to Pennsylvania. He was in the French Indian War, and he was driving a supply wagon for General Braddock's troops. And in this particular battle, the troops were just being routed by the French. And so he decided he'd had enough, and he just took off in his supply wagon, went to South Carolina. So I guess he was technically a deserter, but I'm glad he did.
Yeah.
But he lived to be 102,
Wow.
outlived 4 wives, and we have been, and you have been, to his grave, because he was kind of one of the pioneers of Gaston County.
All right. Do you have any other questions?
I don't. I'm out.
Well, is there anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. I just, it's a real honor to get to do this, and just the thought that maybe one day my grandkids and great grandkids will get to hear what I have to say. It's just really something to think about that. So I hope you future generations out there, I hope you appreciate this.
Well, thank you very much for doing it.
All right. Well, in case this is somehow stored under a different container, this is December 24th, 2007.